Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased and delighted to have this presentation here in the presence of all scholars and colleagues from different branches and disciplines. I have special gratitude and thankfulness to Dr. Joseph Timrell, Dr. Larry Sims, and Dr. Jeff King for everything, including the invitation. So I'm going to talk about culture and mindfulness, and I'm trying to provide you with a preamble so that we can have questions and responses at the end to get things more engaged. Understanding culture can be mindful or mindless, so we can approach cultural perspectives from a mindful or a mindless perspective, and I'm trying to present and provide you with a number of components that can enhance our mindfulness in terms of culture and cross-cultural understanding. So to begin with, I'm going to elucidate a number of points in terms of what is it that we have done at Harvard in regards to mindfulness and how that could develop a cross-cultural understanding. We have identified a number of components. One of them is creating new categories of information and knowledge. So the idea here is that when we are mindful, we are going to be creating ideas, information, knowledge constantly. Whereas when we are mindless, we are bound and circumscribed by the flux of the previously established ideas. So possibility, for example, to a mindless mind is just bound and circumscribed within the specific parameters. If you say something is possible or something is impossible, people are going to identify that with the pre-established, prescribed forms of cognition. Therefore, they say the policy suggests that you can't do it, it's not possible. Regulations do not allow us to prescribe this, so it's not possible. If you had gone to people 400 years ago and had talked to them about a flight, internet, possibility of a telephone conversation, they would have said it's impossible. And they would have said, we're going to pray for you so that you're going to be fine, go back to your houses, things are going to be fine with you, don't worry. And you can see that it's possible now. So the problem with the mainstream cross-cultural program is that it's sort of subsumed and compartmentalized in a specific positivist-driven psychology. And as a result of that, it does not allow itself to go beyond those categories. And accordingly, it's not possible to see and experience the world as experienced by the other. Studies demonstrated that when people at Washington, University of Washington, were asked to express their viewpoints about Africa, most of them came up with concepts like tigers, wild animals, barbarian approach, brutality, and so on. And they had no idea and no clue of the phenomenological experience of African culture. The same holds true when you compare low context versus high context cultures. According to World Trade Organization, WTO, most of the negotiations between Chinese and European have failed because of cultural misunderstanding. So you can see that in WTO, you got a new chapter on the impact of cultures. And as a result of that, they have come up with all these new forms of understanding that when you're going, for example, to Arab people, make sure that you do not let them see the sole of your shoes. If you go to China, make sure that you do not pronounce or say the first name. With Japanese, don't rub your shoulder. With people, for example, in South America, make sure that you rub your elbows before you go to the table for negotiation, and these kinds of things. But what I'm trying to say is that when we come from a mindful perspective on cultural psychology, we are going to be more open towards not only the perfunctory meaning of culture, but also towards the profound manifestation of cultural understanding. In low context cultures, we have straightforward form of articulation. So if somebody wants, for example, a cup of tea or something, you might say, give me a cup of tea. But in high context cultures, people are not going to go with that. They are going to say that, you know, 2/3 of the body is composed of water, and tea is good because it's just a branch of that, and God created everything from water, and as a result of that, you've got to be that. So they come up with all these 7 layers to go ahead with why it is good to prescribe tea for you. Lack of understanding low context and high context intercultural programs will stop people from understanding how cultures develop phenomenological experience. In doing so, I need to use a phrase from Wittgenstein where he talks about grammar of understanding. He says you receive a letter from your beloved, and the letter says, I'll be arriving in Vienna at 6:30 this afternoon. You show the letter to everybody who speaks that language, they understand what it means. But your understanding of that letter is way different from everybody else because you're attuned to not only the surface perfunctory layers of that content, but also you are attuned and geared towards marginal, affective, associated, emotional components of what the letter is all about. The same holds true for cultures. Sometimes we just remain at the level of information. And information is, you know, all over the place. You get billions of information because of all these resources that we have. But cultural understanding is in dire need of an ontological experience. Ontological experience is getting us involved because it existentially gets us engaged in the process of experiencing the frameworks, the reference points of how cultures have developed and communicated with one another. I think one of the things that Margaret Mead has contributed to our world in terms of her works and everything is developing that sense of ontological understanding that we need to have when we want to approach culture. So mindfulness with this perspective begins with create new categories. Create new ideas as you openly look for the hidden, the cryptic, the unfamiliar layers of life. So, and it has implications in clinical psychology, in social psychology. One of the things that I have found quite helpful is I tell my clients, go and look at your partner from 5 positive perspectives, 5 new positive perspectives. They come back and they say, well, I've got a different feeling because I tried to see something from a different perspective. I just have a different feeling of this, you know. We did this with chambermaids, and they got a different feeling overall. Their fatigue was replaced by a sense of vitality because they could examine and explore some things that they did not in the past. Cultivation and socialization does not allow us to experience mindfulness because we've been exposed, we've been cultivated frequently and extensively to something, and as a result of that, those messages are going to be popping up always in our mind when we listen to people. And therefore, we get ourselves paralyzed because we would not be able to listen as mindfully as possible. The result is rehearsal listening. We all have seen and experienced roundtable discussions where people pretend that they are listening. But when the conversation is over, you see no connection between what he was saying and what she was saying because there's just rehearsal. I'm trying to practice what I'm going to say when this guy's over, and he does the same thing, she does the same thing. There is no rapport, there is no synergy, there is nothing, no dialogical conversation. The same happens when we go and approach a culture and it's tape recording listening. A tape recording, have you ever talked to a tape recorder? And at the end said, oh, thank you for listening. You never say that because a tape recorder is not going to provide us with the gift of presence. The presence is going to be gone. Cultural understanding requires an understanding of the phenomenological experience of the actor. I've got something which is going to be published soon. It's called Questioning the Unquestionability of the Perspective of the Observer in Psychology. And the claim here is that psychology in its mainstream form has mainly come from the perspective of the observer. And as a result of that, it almost rarely takes into account the perspective of the actor. And when you do not pay attention to the perspective of the actor, you have no idea how the actor is going to unfold itself. Therefore, misunderstanding, miscommunication, all of them unfold themselves one after the other one. So here we need to, from a mindful perspective, make a distinction between objective truth and subjective truth. The objective truth is here, out in our external world. The subjective truth is not going to happen without a phenomenological, dialogical conversation with realities around ourselves. So a mindful perspective in cross-cultural psychology goes for a phenomenological involvement. And that phenomenological involvement begins with a preparation to listen, a predilection to embrace, a predisposition to welcome new information. You know, studies have been recently conducted with people doing fMRI, and they were given pictures of one person in the center with a lot of people in the background, and they were asked to rate them in terms of emotional factors between 1 and 10. And they found out when people switch their cognitive styles from one to the other, the one that they're not accustomed to, their brain activity is going to show, you know, some changes because they're not used to that. So once we have what we call mutual accommodation, which doesn't mean that you have to change your cultural perspective, or you have to revamp your understanding, or you have to just embrace a new type of understanding and you have to serve as a convert or something. It just means that welcome new information, the information that may unfold itself in different forms, and as a result of that, we need to have a shift of paradigm. I argue that our mainstream cross-cultural psychological program is intensely embedded within specific forms of paradigms that do not allow us, in terms of research methods, to experience multiple perspectives, numerous forms of knowing. And as a result of that, we would be just stranded in our pre-established forms of knowing. So a mindful perspective, as Ellen Langer at Harvard points out, begins with a position of not knowing. We would be better off if we just begin with a position of not knowing instead of a position of knowing. Because the moment we go as somebody who knows, we think that we've got all these pliers and screwdrivers and all of them, and we just go and we want to have our own diagnosis. But lots of time we prescribe before even we have diagnosis. It's like you go to an eye doctor and without examining you, he or she prescribes something and just you put them on and you say, "Doctor, I can't see it." She says, "Be optimist." You know, try to use your optimism. How ungrateful you are that you're not paying attention to my gift. And then the possibility of going to that doctor is going to be zilch because the doctor is going to prescribe something before he or she even has a diagnosis. And intercultural programs sometimes end up being just a prescription before the diagnosis. And I think this has got roots in epistemology, in ontology, in understanding the interplay of culture and psychology. So we would be better off if we begin from the position of not knowing, in the sense that we would be openly and flexibly welcoming the flux of information for ourselves in more comprehensive manners. If we just come up with a non-linear, and I'm not suggesting that linear operations should be taken down everything else. I'm not suggesting that the other forms of understanding should be the dominant. I'm just saying that we need to discuss advantages, liabilities, disadvantages in an interlocutory program so that we can find out what is it that is going to happen if we just experience that shift in paradigm. So creating new categories and new information would help us understand how the familiar is going to be looked upon from an unfamiliar perspective. So we've done lots of experiments. In one, students at MIT were told to look at something like an object, and they were told that this is a hammer. The second group was told this could be a hammer. What group do you think was more creative? The group that was told this could be a hammer, because they could look into more possibilities. Now, the studies in social psychology, as you acknowledge, demonstrate that people who experience multicultural experiences in real, authentic manners would end up being more creative in comparison with people who may not have that multicultural sort of experience, because the thing with multicultural experience is that it allows us to experientially understand how perspectives can exist in different formats. It's like you go and see clients, for example, in Seattle, then you come and talk to people in Bellingham, then you go to Big Apple, then you go to Boston, Beantown, and then you see all these forms of perspectives. You know, William Labov did this when he talked to people, black people, and tried to find out the system of thinking could make sense in spite of the fact that they may not necessarily go from a standard mode of saying. It could go from a non-standard form. And as a result of that, sagacity and perspicacity may make sense away from the pre-established compartmentalization that they've had. Now, this is not just a matter of cognition. Sternberg has talked about thinking styles, and he talks about mindfulness as a sort of competencies in terms of skills, in terms of cognition. What I argue is that mindfulness can turn out to be an ontological shift. So it means that it can help us experience a new form of being. And a new form of being is going to ultimately develop a radical transformation of consciousness. And that radical transformation of consciousness is going to open up possibilities right in front of our eyes in terms of our intrapersonal and interpersonal manifestation. What this means is that in order to be interculturally mindful, we need to focus on at least 3 factors: motivational factors, knowledge factors, and the skills factors. Motivational factors because it helps us explore how needs analysis, the assessment of needs, can be understood, from a different culture, from a different perspective. So what is it about attractiveness? What is it about interaction, empathy, support? All of them that have got different meanings. And it also helps us understand how, in addition to core meanings, we need to pay attention to marginal meanings. Marginal meanings that could be easily concealed to oblivion because of our pre-planned educational packages. It's like if you're a clinician, a psychoanalyst, psychologist, and you see a client, the first thing that comes to your mind is the result of all these research and learnings and the client may say something else. And as a result of that, you may not be able to listen to what that context is going to be all about. Therefore, the more we are mindfully exploring the possibility of looking at the unfamiliar, we would be better off in terms of creating novelty in our own understanding of cultural issues and cultural programs. Now, as we go ahead with this exploration, we find out that we can welcome new information. We welcome new information, and here's a subtle point that goes back to how we look at language from a cross-cultural perspective. Language can be just taken as an instrument that just helps us communicate and say something, or language can be described as a way of living, as a way of being. When we choose to be mindful about language, it gives rise to a new understanding of language, because language can be so creational. Language can be so creational for our forms of being. The self-talk that we have is most of the time automatic, mindless. It imposes, prescribes certain forms of perspectives. Once we try to be mindful, we try to get that mindless perspective out of the scene, and we try to be as choice-oriented as possible. This helps us welcome new possibilities, new information that we have. And from an intercultural perspective, it is of great significance because you've got huge examples of misunderstanding between China, United States, Arab world, Europeans, that are fraught with not understanding how decoding takes place in a cultural setting. And apart from all this classification that we have, low context versus high context, we would just be better off if we can listen to information that is out there, but our mindset, our schemas may not necessarily allow us to think about those. So when we welcome new information in a mindful-oriented project, what happens is that we would have an openness towards multiple points of view. And that multiple points of view has got a lot to do with understanding the contextual factors. A lot of these projects made by UN and UNESCO and other places at international level fail because they do not examine the cultural context of people that they are going to be implemented for. It's like you go to a class, grade 2, elementary school, and you use the following words. You say, I'm delighted to be here. Epistemological understanding of your status quo is indebted to the qualitative analysis of your previously formulated transactional analysis through which the sine qua non of your qualitative components need to be understood through a transcendental analysis of the Kantian philosophy. How are those poor kids going to respond? You just have got these pen and pencils, and no matter what kind of families they have been brought up, they just demonstrate the responses in a way that is saying, hey, this context is now taken into consideration. In our cultural programs, when we do not pay attention towards cultural configuration, towards cultural interplay of different levels of understanding, we end up producing programs which are good for nothing except a few that are seemingly the so-called samples of the population. So when you look at some of these interviews in CNN and Fox News and a lot of other television networks about intercultural programs, and you can see that the interviewer and interviewees are seemingly engaged in a conversation, and you get them analyzed, the data suggests that there is no conversation about the real underlying psychological factors of how culture is going to control itself in those particular parts of the world, because it's just a discourse created by a mentality that moves in line with certain forms and perfunctory celebration of certain concepts without any attachment, any connectedness to the underlying rigorous factors that should be taken into consideration. So from a mindful perspective, go beyond that superficial look. We need to be exploring the rigorous, recondite layers of those underlying elements, albeit unconscious, in numerous manifestations of cultural forms, nonverbal, verbal, and even in layers that may not have been concealed, that may have been concealed to oblivion because of our mindlessness. I've got numerous examples of these that I have clips, and they require a course, at least for 2 semesters or something, to work on. But you can look at numerous films, like if you watch, for example, Night on Earth, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch this, or Love in the Afternoon, or The Portrait of Jenny. These are the classic ones. Or the new ones like Moscow and Hudson, and see how cultural discourses, because I use a lot of films and feature movies when I teach social psychology or other classes, health psychology, abnormal psychotherapy, and all of, because I think that feature movies are great tools to demonstrate the configuration of cultural components as they have been established implicitly or explicitly. Whether we talk about implicit attitude or explicit attitude, they can come up with different forms in a cultural setting. So this openness allows us to understand the interlocutory perspective from the perspective of the other, not from the perspective of the observer. And I argue that as long as we do not explore the possibility of that perspective, we just end up being recursive in our own syntagmatic analysis. And that syntagmatic analysis
and the paradigmatic analysis that they have been subscribed to may just produce nothing except counterproductive programs when it comes to solving problems. You know, we've got all these talks about international dialogues, international conversations, intercultural programs, but they may really unfold themselves as destructive programs because they are alien to the underlying reality of people. And as a result of that, they just fail to address issues that they should be addressed. So I suggest that we can go ahead and proceed with what I call a global mindful program for cross-cultural understanding with an aim that I call it ironic mind, a peace-oriented mind. Because when you look at some of these cultural configurations in Western epistemology, you can see that paradigms are mainly coming from a conflict-oriented perspective, where things are always opposed to one another. And because of that conflict-oriented framework and configuration, you can rarely see any sort of reconciliatory approach in a real dialogical sense. If it talks about reconciliation, it's just an imposed form of reconciliation. It is not something that is going to be associated with a peace-oriented form in intrapersonal level. And when you look at works by Lasswell and others in the past and compare them with Huntington's work on conflict of civilizations and all of them, you can see that that sense of conflict-oriented approach is somehow implicitly lingering in all these forms and sedimentations of cultural views and perspectives. And the question is, what if we just change the reference point? What if we just go ahead with a new understanding of a reference point that people have got? For example, there are cultures that develop a new reference point, and that reference point has not been taken seriously. There are cultures that talk about the worldview towards interpersonal and intrapersonal issues from a different paradigm, and that paradigm has not even yet been recognized. So these qualities require a number of things, and they're of great significance for cross-cultural issues, because in cross-cultural programs, we often have ambiguity, and we often have tension. And the more ambiguity and tension we experience, the less effective we can become in terms of providing solutions. Because when you've got a high level of anxiety, when you've got a high level of ambiguity, and when you have a high level of uncertainty, people are most of the time mindless because they can't tolerate it. The argument here is that when we train people in a real mindful way to develop mindful strategies, they develop these strategies. They have comfort with ambiguity and the ability to see information in its context rather than as universal and deliberate. So they would be able to understand the reality of, it's like education as planned versus education as experienced. You go to a class, education, the Department of Education says the first of the class, make sure that you break the ice, you've got everyone's name, and you go and say, well, this is what it says. But when you go to a class and you see the context of the class, that's way different from what the required program suggests. You need to be oblivious of that context, or you need to understand the context. Understanding that context could help you reinforce and increase your praxis. So the same holds true here. For cross-cultural programs, as long as we get ourselves stranded in the so-called pre-planned prescriptive modes of analysis, pre-planned modes of analyzing issues in different boxes and different compartmentalization, we would be oblivious to understand what the reality is all about. So on the other hand, when we increase mindfulness, people's tolerance for understanding uncertainty, would go up. It's like post-formal. After Piaget, those who embrace post-formal thinking versus formal, they could have a further effective tolerance for ambiguity. They could understand how ambiguity could be, warmly welcomed. But The argument here is that when we are mindless and embedded in a mindless-based program, we would not have tolerance for tension. We would not have tolerance for ambiguity. And a little bit of uncertainty makes us, feel discombobulated, confused, irritated, frustrated, and it makes us become reactive. Whereas if you come from the perspective of a mindful-based program, we would be able to, number one, reduce the uncertainty through developing a prolifically effective dialogical interaction, through understanding the interpersonal needs in a more comprehensive manner, through exploring the perspectives of the other, which may have been marginalized through our own narratives in a macro level, and our grand narratives may have suffocated them. And as a result of that, that uncertainty is going to be effectively dealt with. Whereas in a mindless program, we become usually defensive and passive in terms of responding to those. So the argument here is that as we increase a mindful-based program in an intercultural, cross-cultural level, we would be opening up the room for not only engagement, but also proactive involvement in creating a new framework, in creating new spaces. Liminal spaces can emerge because of that mindfulness. And liminal spaces nobody has ever thought about in terms of pre-established schemas, because schemas tell us, hey, if you want to go to Fairhaven, this is the way to go. This is I-5, exit 252. You're going to end up being in Ross or Bellingham, and then that's the way you got to go. Otherwise, you're going to bark up the wrong tree. And we have the same assumption as we go and experience the meanders of our scholarly conversations. We think that the package is available, but there is no package. There is no map. The map is going to be created. We can use the map. I'm not suggesting that we have to denounce the maps. I'm not suggesting that we have to be unthankful and ungrateful to whatever the maps have all been about. I'm just saying that there could be new maps. And a new map can help us understand our presence, our spaces, not only in a more effective manner, but it also helps us become more creative in exploring, discovering, realizing, and understanding emergent spaces, liminal spaces that have not yet happened, but it could. And if they happen to happen, they open up not only new horizons of possibility, but also new horizons of togetherness. But also they open up new horizons of a collaborative project in affecting the quality of life for everybody. And in that collaboration, nobody is going to experience mastery or superiority or inferiority. It's just being on the same page in a sense of togetherness with not only illuminating parts, but also a sense of synergy that is going to refrain from social movement, and it's going to refrain from groupthink, because those are the two things that always, in a cross-cultural program, may interfere as either confounding variables or something that stop you from going forward, or proceeding with your program. But social loafing, groupthink, other forms of interference that may impede the process of an effective, quintessential mindful program, they can just be dealt with in a more effective manner. And as a result of that, we would be better off understanding the world, not also from an epistemological sense, but also from an ontological sense. To exemplify what I mean, if somebody tells you, do you know what is swimming all about? And you've written all these books about it, and you've had conferences about how to swim, and you've had papers on it, but you have never ever, experienced the flux of water. You have never put yourself into a swimming pool. That's not ontological, that's just epistemological. The same holds true for love, for pain, for passion, for prayer, for faith. You know, have you seen the movie The Wrong Man, Henry Fonda? It's a good movie in terms of understanding how people can have a shift from cognition to a more quintessential understanding of being. So it's a good movie. If you just watch the movie, specifically the ending part, it shows how a person is going to come to realize that there are different modes of being that operate, but we just need to open up. And one more thing that I have to explicate, and I can't forbear adding it, is that sometimes cross-cultural program is severely entrapped by rational mind project-oriented programs instead of experiential mind. What do I mean by experiential or rational mind? I give you a simple example. If you've got a student who's got stage fright and he or she does not have the guts to go and talk in front of a class, and you go and sit with the student and talk about, you know, philosophical fundamental points of cognition and try to use not only Albert Ellis and William James and Socrates and Aristotle, but also other scholars and thinkers to say that, hey, presentation is good, fun, go and do it. He's going to like what you say. She's going to agree. Even she could be more in agreement with you. But when she goes in front of people, again, you know, jitters come, trepidation, fears, because you have only had a chance to convince her or him from a rational perspective. But there's no experiential convincing. You have not been able to convince them unless you go and say, hey, sit in front of these two people and speak up. And now 4 people, now 3 people, you give him more experiences ontologically in terms of existential involvement, existential engagement. As he or she is experiencing this flux of engagement, she will accept possibilities in a more effective manner. Cross-cultural programs are in dire need of a shift from merely rational-based programs to more experientially mindful programs in which dialogical conversation, rapport, understanding the amicable influencing skills instead of destructive counterproductive programs can be taken into account in a more mindful manner. In doing this, we need to go beyond elaboration like Wood model. We need to go beyond Yale model. And we need to go beyond Alan Monroe's model in persuading people to collaborate and cooperate with, you know, whatever the project is all about, in developing and creating new phases of being in a more amicable, amiable, constructive, productive manner. So Dr. King told me that 45 minutes is for my presentation, and then we have questions and maybe, so I'm thankful to you because of your listening and your mindful nonverbal communication as I was talking, and your eye movement tracking. By the way, there was another study that they did for eye movement tracking. They found out that when people are after fMRI, that as they have a shift from the ground to the foreground, the figure, the central figure to the background, their eye movement changes if they are going to go ahead with their own style of thinking. So if you have a holistic form of thinking, for example, you've got somebody in the central figure, and you're asked to rate him or her in terms of emotional state, you're going to look at all other people in the background to guess how he or she is feeling. So the study found out the eye movement tracking increased per second for these people, namely the Asian ones who had this holistic, whereas others who did not come up with this sort of package, their eye movement tracking was way different from them. So I was just trying to be paying attention to subliminal nonverbal pupil dilation and expansion, one way or the other, suggesting as much as possible. So thank you very much for your listening. Okay, if there are questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking with us today.
Thank you.
So I agree with what you're saying, and what we just got was the academic aspect, the cognitive aspect. How do we have the experiential aspect? How do we actually, where does the rubber really meet the road in this so it can actually happen?
Well, that could happen in a long day workshop that should involve experiential programs. And we actually have done this. So what we do as examples is that we give people, for example, assignments to do them mindlessly, and then we give assignments to do them mindfully, and then experience in 2 columns, the first column, the second column, and see how these experiences can give rise to different senses of what is this experience, like? How does it look like? And but that cannot be happening in just 45 minutes or something. This is just welcome to Bellingham. When you enter, say welcome to my world, Elvis Presley. Have you heard of that? I'll be waiting there just for you.
And then we're talking about putting this into practice. In writing a research grant or in trying to publish your work, you have to follow those restrictions very carefully about, justifying why you're doing this, because knowing what you think the outcome will be, and it's very rational, very specific. And within the discipline, how can we combat that and be able to engage in and publish research that is online?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, Ellen Langer has done, I had a talk at Harvard a week ago comparing Langer with Kierkegaard. And one of the things that I mentioned, and she was sitting there and she liked it very much so, is that she speaks the language of positivist psychology to demonstrate and corroborate and substantiate the possibility of going beyond positivist-driven psychology. So I'm not suggesting that when you write a grant proposal or something, go beyond and just write down something that just say, who is this person? Is she fine? I'm just saying that if there are opportunities for highlighting this in a conversation, in a program, like the good thing with Western Washington University is this Center for Cross-Cultural Program, and I think that it can have a tremendous positive impact, not only in just the state of Washington, but also right across the nation, even for North America, through introducing, propounding, proposing, discussing, presenting new frameworks in cross-cultural programs that tell people, hey, wake up and smell the coffee. This is not going to work out. And as you write a proposal, one part is about the statement of the problem. That's different from the statement of the question. So when you write down the statement of the problem, we can identify, we can explicate and elucidate how getting stranded in just one way may end up in nothing except paralysis of analysis. And as a result of that, it just is associated with procrastination. It does not solve the problem. So why should we not consider? We're not trying to just say that, the University of Washington 10 years ago, or maybe more, they did 2 types of research on family issues, one qualitative, quantitative about family issues, and they found out that each could be complementary in one way or the other. So I'm not suggesting that we should just shut down the doors to everything in the so-called, for example, quantitative methods. I'm just suggesting that we need to develop that awareness, again, through examples, through cases, and conversations, and programs that there is not just one way of knowing that needs to be celebrated. There could be multiple ways. And going just with one way is going to not only circumscribe our path of understanding, but it also imposes a form of prochialism through which we cannot experience any sort of exploration, neither emancipation. Okay? Okay, great question. And that was a good question too. From a mindful perspective, you need to be mindful of everybody in terms of, so if you just say, it's an interesting question, make sure that you're mindful to say the same thing to the other person with a different phrase. Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. Is there any exercises or techniques that you could recommend to us that could increase our mindfulness?
Sure, that's a good question too. When you go home tonight, make sure that you look at the unfamiliar. You fight for otherwise. Smile differently. Hug differently. Experience the person right beside you in a different way. Explore 5 different things about that person. New and positive. I'm not just saying positive. Martin Seligman says at the end of the day, ask yourself, what happened to you, in a good manner today, and go ahead with that sort of. I'm saying positive and new. And you can see that your feelings, your emotional configuration are going to be way different. Because, make sure that next time when you're around campus and you look at all these flowers and trees and everything, look at something from a different perspective. An outsider can always help us understand something that we have never understood because of our cultivation. Because he or she will show us and say, hey, have you ever taken a look at this? And then we see, oh, this is something that I have not paid attention to. So pay attention towards not only the familiar, but also the unfamiliar, and try to get that included through positive and new things. Next time when you say hello, when you say goodbye, when you shake someone's hand, try. Helen Keller says, to meet some people is just like a fine poem. It gives you that sense of exhilaration when they shake hands with you, when they have this sort of impression. When they leave, you say, what did she say? They just have this impact because they allow you to experience something that you have not experienced because of your custom way of thinking. So we can do that. We can always take a look from a different perspective, and that perspective can always be with us if we just try to. But the problem is that if you ask people, did you see the sunlight today, or did you see the moonlight last night? If they take you seriously, they say, I've got projects to do. I'm tied up. They don't have rooms for that sense of exploring the unknown, exploring the unfamiliar, because they are so bombarded by schemas, priming, scripts that suggest, hey, here's the way to do. You go to aisle number 4, and toothpaste is, where you can find. And the same holds true when we just go for our own exploration. We cannot possibly understand. A few years ago, there was some study in California, so they go to black populated areas and they say, I'm here to do some statistical reports for University of California. So the black guy tries to find out if the person belongs to the community. So he comes up with something that demonstrates if he has got that sense of connectedness or not. He says, so you're here to check out my old lady, huh? And the person, unaware of what he's trying to say, becomes again more formal. And as a result of that, conversation goes up. Whereas if he had that sense of perspective, in terms of shift of perspective, you could have come up with saying, like, no brother, you can cover. So that they would have more, they would have a more effective sense of togetherness. So that's one of the things that you can do. And then, have you seen the Dead Poet Society? When Robin Williams says, I want to tell you that you can always take a different perspective, and that perspective can help you experience something new. That perspective can just begin right from the moment that you say goodbye, and you walk down campus, try to look at those and see how those unfamiliar pictures can unfold themselves. Then suddenly in the middle of the night, you just wake up and come up with this new composition of yourself and things around yourself that they boil down to some exquisite novel ideas. And they all go ahead with things in interpersonal and intrapersonal level. Okay, yes, please.
I'm interested in what you think about experiencing culture through technology. So, technologically mediated experiences of culture. Do you think those are effective at helping different cultures understand one another?
Yeah, I taught at least for 16 institutions in North America. And I taught for University of Phoenix for about 4 years. Online classes, FlexNet, on-ground, flying, all of them. And you know, online programs, if you're more into technologically based program, they can help us understand things from a different perspective in terms of nonverbal pitch in its own contextual framework, but they may not give us that possibility that we can have a face-to-face kind of thing. Because, you know, all these physiological texts suggest that we receive around 11 million bits of information per second. And 15 to 16% is only processed. And our cultural experiences have got an impact on our perceptual understanding of realities around ourselves too. So, having said that, technology is fine, but you know, Habermas and Gadamer talk about technology, and they talk about how technology can be limiting. We created technology, but we can be so badly subjugated through the tyrannical subjugation of technology. And as a result of that, it may impose some forms of thinking, because medium is the message kind of thing from Marshall McLuhan might also suggest that technology with its own configurational framework, it might prescribe certain ways of analysis. And sometimes we identify ourselves, and this is something that Sternberg realized when he was talking about this, deleterious, metaphoric implications of computer and brain and mind, that sometimes we get so much indulged in that sense of metaphoric aspect of technology that after a while we identify ourselves with technology, and as a result of that we forget everything about our own being and our own selves, and therefore we get everything concealed to oblivion. You know, Bruner in APA, when he talked about intelligence and in terms of narrative intelligence, he was just talking about the cold winter positivism coming from the computational models, is gone. We just need to reconsider and revamp. So technology is great, but the only problem is that sometimes we get so much, engaged in terms of the metaphoric implications, and as a result of that, we might just get that tantamount to our own ontological being, and it deprives us of looking into implications in a more comprehensive manner. That was a good question. Yes, please.
I'm wondering about opening up a dialogue between sides that are really entrenched in their positions, or how do you get them to a mindful place that's actually mutually beneficial, where to get there, they would have to acknowledge that they have to give up some of their own self-interest, that they have something to lose.
Yeah.
So, to open up that new perspective, seems like they have to be, both sides have to be able to relax and really face that sort of danger, that fearful place, that they might lose something that's important to them. Can you talk about that at all?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. And I think the answer to that question needs to be taken into account from different perspectives. One is that, number one, we cannot help people reconsider their compartmentalization merely through a rational approach, because they need technology right now. We just need to go. Remember that Ericksonian parable that people find out that somebody is saying that he's Jesus, and all these social workers and psychologists and psychoanalysts go and say, "You're not Jesus. Let me show all these documents that suggest Jesus was somebody else." And they bring all this documentation. Erickson goes and says,
Okay, let me just go ahead and get this figured out. So he goes to the person and says, I want to say hello to Jesus. You know, so the approach includes an acknowledgement. We cannot help people understand that they may have barked up the wrong tree before we develop rapport, acknowledgement of the emotionally based mind. You see what I'm saying? We cannot help people accept 2 + 2 or 4 before we go ahead and say, hey, let's find out what is this all about. Because a lot of times, deep down, the vociferous cry, the clamorous manifestation of people's anger, it's just a need for acknowledgement.
But if there's a hierarchical structure in place, and how do you get the people who are already in power to come to a place where they...
Well, in a therapeutic conceptualization, if we use the language of counseling clinical psychology, we just need to help them realize their blind spots. You know, we just need to, in a dialogical conversation, help them. It's like somebody who's so sensitive about the elderly, but she is so insensitive about children's rights. You can't just go and say, hey, you're so insensitive. You just need to get yourself engaged in a dialogue, number one, you know, say that everything is fine, because mindfulness is associated with non-evaluative measures. We don't want to evaluate, you know, we don't want to just put people down, sell them short, because it's against mindfulness. We just want to help people understand that maybe this position needs to be reconsidered. But that requires rapport, acknowledgement of their emotional configuration. Otherwise, it's my way or highway, you know, and it's not going to work out. Because, but I think that regardless of the degree of a recalcitrant approach, regardless of the degree of hubris, regardless of the degree and intensity of the overbearing attitude, regardless of the sophisticated manifestation of all these egotistic and egoist forms of manifestation, we can come up with a creative, novel way of, hey, let me first pamper your emotionally based mind. And you just feel comfortable that I'm here and you're here and we're together, and I'm not trying to be condescending, and I'm not going to reveal you. And I'm not here to get you in a fish expedition type of process. Let's just figure out, and then this is going to help both of us. That is going to be, and I think that nobody has ever used that.
That's pretty radical.
You know, it's just, they just say, the moment you say, oh, you're a coffee person? Oh, get out. I'm a tea person. You know, and then the compartmentalization is going to be boiling down to nothing except destructive manifestation of power. And I think that this can develop a new strategy. And it's not manipulative, it's just a matter of, well, we need this. Because you know what? One of the things that I have taught psychology of negotiations for corporate people too, and I always point out this to them that, you know, new definition on negotiation is management of interdependencies. You know, it's not just what you grab and you claim. It's just a matter of management of interdependencies. If you want to manage your interdependencies, you need to accept that sometimes, specifically, for example, negotiation among couples, and it's suggested by some for men that even if your wife says something that is fully wrong, the best policy for you is to shut up. You know, sometimes it works because you understand the realization of that emotion-based psychological factor, but later on you can just come up and say, well, when things are fine, let's just figure out. So make sure that you do not go ahead with the following policies as they suggest, that when you enter a house, don't declare and announce big strategic, you know, policies or something. Go ahead with something mild. And don't do that when you go for dinner. And don't do that before going to bed. So strategic policies need to be explicated in other frameworks in terms of that acknowledgement. Thank you very much for this wonderful question. Okay, there was some She raised her hand first. As a social justice approach, is that okay? Or just, I'm far from that, but I'm just trying to be.
As a student right now and a student interested in psychology, I know there's a lot of rational definitions in a lot of psychology classes that are helpful to learning how to become a therapist or become something in psychology. But what would you also say is important beyond rational information to become a therapist or to become somebody who can further the field of psychology?
Yeah, and that's a great illuminating question. It's a question out of reflexivity. And the answer to that question is that we need to think about psychology of possibility. The psychology of possibility suggests that if you can only do one, not just too many, because we're not going to talk about outliers and statistical, issues and deviation and standard. If you can just do one thing in the external world, or even in the intrapersonal world, that one thing can corroborate the possibility of doing that. So come up with your aspirations, set your goals, broaden your perspective, and imagine and visualize how that possibility can change and affect the quality of life for everybody around you. And you could be the forerunner of a new school of thought, not only based on what we know of so far, but something that can have a tremendous positive impact in our understanding, things around ourselves. Because remember, when psychology departed from philosophy, it silenced some questions. And some questions, were somehow posed as inappropriate. If you ask those questions, you're not a part of the club. You should not ask those questions. But I think that a mindful approach, remember Anscombe was the chair in Oxford. She said that nowadays psychology is more in dire need of what she called philosophical psychology. And she says that philosophical psychology would help psychologists open up understanding in a more effective manner, not only for themselves, but also for practical implications. I believe that political psychology, psychology of mass media, or counseling, clinical psychology, social psychology, could benefit from that shift if they reconsider the pillars that formulated what the mindset about psychology needs to be for our present time. Okay? Yes, please. Well, you can choose to be mindless if you want, but if your mindfulness increases, the argument suggests that you try to be mindful instead of mindless. Most of our learning takes place mindlessly, as Ellen Langer has already agreed and talked about. And most of our educational programs are mindless. They come more from an automatic perspective. And the schemas impose their own form of understanding because of what they are. But I think that if you understand the gift of mindfulness, so you can even see that in your own daily sort of activities. You could have had, for example, orange juice for the past 15 years of your life, and automatically mindlessly you do the same tomorrow. When you become mindful, you say, hey, this is the choice. I choose to do the following. I choose not to do the following. And then that mindfulness allows you to experience something else, not only about your affect and feeling and emotion, but also your being is going to undergo some fundamental changes as you increase and elevate and enhance the level of mindfulness. That was a good question. Thank you.
Can I make a comment on that as well?
Sure.
My sense is that people do choose mindlessness because they're afraid. They're afraid of moving into that space where it's unknown and their own selves are going to be exposed and therefore close the doors.
Yes.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, John Gottman talked about emotional heritage. that we all have because of our cultivation process. So the emotional heritage that we have inherited from the past may make us mindless. Imagine if you tell a joke, and instead of people laughing at what you're saying and demonstrating a sense of humor, they look at you and they say, "Have you got some change? How do you feel?" Now imagine if somebody has experienced that sort of inattention right from the beginning of birth. And he or she has had that experience of mindlessness in terms of needs and attention to this point. Now, through an increase of mindfulness, we can help a person become more mindful of, well, I am not going to be doomed for failure because of whatever has happened to me. I can just go ahead and revamp the whole thing from a different perspective. And that emotional heritage with the package of mindlessness can be replaced by a more mindful approach. But the thing is that when people hear these ideas, because the first thing that pops up in their mind is premature cognitive commitment. And premature cognitive commitment is the source of mindlessness because it lets us act from one single perspective. And when we act from a single perspective, it's like, I'm looking at this part and I'm not seeing anything here. But once we increase our mindfulness, we understand how this premature cognitive commitment can be paralyzed. But the moment we just have that commitment because of our schemas or the script or our first impression or whatever you want to call them, we see no possibility of going beyond that sense of commitment. Okay, any more questions or?
Could you give us the titles of some of your favorite movies? Again, you had Night on Earth, Moscow and Hudson.
Okay. Well, this is not a free association, but I'll just give you some.
No, but you were talking about
So,
that.
yes, that's
that
right.
period
Yeah,
of-
sure. I mean, The Portrait of Jenny.
Portrait of Jenny, thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. That's a good one. 1927. Paul Mooney. Shadow of a Doubt. The Wrong Man. Hurricane.
Thank you.
A Man Who Knew Too Much. Rear Window. North by Northwest.
Thank you.
Madam X. The Key Glasses. Executive Suite. Love in the Afternoon.
So I have to say I appreciated your emphasis on interventions and thinking about mindfulness in this way regarding interventions. And I wondered, you think about schools and community organizations and things like this. If you were really, would your vision be building from the ground up as an ideal way to intervene to improve?
Absolutely.
And so then how can that be, talk about efficiencies of that. I always feel like you can spiral and come up with a particular niche that would be completely culturally sensitive. And then it's hard to go from there.
Yeah, but you see, that's a wonderful, rigorous question. And I think that it requires a community of committed scholars. It requires the perspicacity of people who have got that vision to go ahead with fathoming the possibility of implementing such projects. It requires perseverance, meticulosity, and understanding and perceptiveness of people who do not just go ahead with something at a theoretical level, but also they have that sense of praxis, practical commitment, and also people who have maybe experienced the bitterness of mindless phenomenological entanglements. If you do this, for example, with people who are having drug abuse on the one hand, or people who have no SEL, social emotional learning, or schools, for example, you probably may notice that
a lot of people who have dropped out from schools, not just because they did not have a good IQ, because they did have problems in social emotional learning. Or other studies demonstrate, at least in Boston, that there's the mismatch of teachers' thinking styles and students, and plus emotional factors, and several other confounding variables that gave rise to that interplay of. So what I'm saying is that it requires real perseverance. It requires an authentic way of, well, I'm here, let's go and do it. It requires an ideological undertaking, something that people can see before they go and raise the chalice of victory at the apex of all those wonderful experiences. Okay? I don't want to make it sound like a campaign for it. Okay? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you I think that I just conclude my remarks with extension of my hopes for everybody who is so wonderful in whatever he or she does here. And I think that Western Washington University, based on my understanding and exploring cross-cultural programs and other programs and wonderful leadership in Department of Psychology and everything else, can serve as a great example in showing the world how things can change and how things can make a difference. Because everything starts from conversation. And we're all the byproduct of a conversation. So if that conversation is going to unfold itself in a more effective manner, I think it just opens up possibility for implementing the practical implications of those conversations. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.